Hi, my name is Audrey Emran Beardsley. I'm an associate professor at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. We've developed a show titled Inside the Academy, during which we honor some of the best scholars in the profession of education. Today I have the honor of interviewing Susan Moore Johnson, professor at Harvard University. It's a pleasure to honor you.
Thank you.
We're going to start.
I'm honored to be honored.
Thank you. We're going to start with you growing up. Tell us about your childhood.
Okay, I grew up in a town, a small suburb right outside of Youngstown, Ohio. And Youngstown was a steel city, a magnificent, thriving steel city until about 1960. And the mills started to close. I always thought that the sky was kind of gray and pink, that's the way sky was generally, and they closed the mills and suddenly the sky was blue and the air was clear. It was actually a tragedy for the community because it was a tremendous recession that hit right after that. But the city's on the Mahoning River, and they always used to say that you could start a fire on the Mahoning River because it had so much trash in it. And so it was a very, very kind of urban industrial area. We lived in a little suburb that was right outside Youngstown called Boardman. And it was, my dad was a high school English teacher in the city. The community that I grew up in was all white, not particularly wealthy, but there was clearly a kind of racial segregation by communities. And in general, our schools were supposed to be better than the ones in the city. So I had a real sense of the difference between the city school and the opportunities there and my own community. But my dad was a very great teacher, and he was the advisor for the yearbook and the newspaper, and so he would have his staff out at our house for picnics and things. And I remember my brother and I both realized that we had never seen so many different kind of people at the houses in our community, except for that. So that was a kind of early awareness of the informal segregation in the North. I had a very unexciting childhood. The neighborhood school was nearby. We all walked. I was in Brownies and Girl Scouts, and went to camp at the YMCA camp in the summer. There was a great camp on Lake Erie. And I just kind of grew up that way. My mom had been an accountant, but she, like every other mom I knew, stayed home and raised children at the time. And it was very much a 50s sort of community, not quite what you see celebrated on television.
Sure.
A little more boring than that, but yeah, that's what it was.
When did you first decide that you wanted to become an educator?
I don't know, was I 3? Was I 4? It was
You grew into it.
Well, it was something, my whole family on my father's side was involved in education. Great aunt, and it was just sort of the family business, essentially, if there was one in our family. And I just grew up being in his classroom, kind of being able to stack the papers. At one point he had me grading the multiple choice exams in his class when I was in high school. And I always just assumed that I would be a teacher. I did the usual play school with my dolls, and I never thought I would do anything else. I don't know whether I really had a clear sense that I wanted to have a career full time until I was, a good deal older, because I didn't know any women who did that, actually. But I clearly expected to teach, to go to college and to teach. And, I graduated from high school in '63, and at that time, pretty much any woman that was going to have a career and a college degree was going to be a teacher or a nurse.
Oh, sure.
It really was.
Sure.
That was, and I thought it was a good thing. So.
Was there a certain teacher that inspired the person you became?
Well, yeah, I think I actually had several good teachers, but the person who was most influential was a guy named Bill Dykens. We called him Dyke. He was my speech coach. So you have to understand, this was a time before Title IX. There were no competitive athletics for girls. You could be a cheerleader, and I did that for a year, and then thought this is really not what I enjoy. So I joined the debate team. My brother was 3 years older than I was, and he was on the debate team. And so when I was in 9th grade, they had me on the debate team, and then I did actually extemporaneous speaking, and there was a very big competitive thing in our area. And so Dyke was my coach, and then he was my senior English teacher. He was, just renowned teacher. And he really was an amazing person, so I've stayed close with him over time. Yeah.
In 1967, you earned your bachelor's degree from Mount Holyoke College, magna cum laude in English literature, and you taught English at Brookline High School in Massachusetts from 1967 to 1976. You earned your master's degree in English and served as an administrator while at Brookline. Tell us about your experiences as assistant housemaster.
Okay, let me back up just a little bit because it was, I graduated from college, and when I was a student in college, my father insisted that I do the coursework for certification. You never know. He would always say, you never know. You might have to earn a living, and so you have to be certified. But this was a very tiny program, and didn't take long to do. So I decided that I wanted actually to do a serious program in teacher education. So that was the Master's of Arts in Teaching program at Harvard. And it was only many years later, that I realized that it was a kind of alternative prep program. It was long, but we had a summer program with student teaching, and then I became the teacher of record in a high school, in Brookline High School. And we had a great arrangement where there were faculty members from Harvard who were also part-time teachers in the schools where we were placed. So it was a kind of link, very close link between our placement and then our Harvard classes. The program allowed you to go to class. It was a 2-year program, and you could do it either by teaching the first year and going back full-time for classes in the second, or you could do it the reverse. And I wanted to teach. I had been in classes for a long time. So I did it that way. I taught and then went back to Harvard and did a fair amount of sub-teaching when I was at the school when I was taking courses, and then went back full-time. So I had a position after the first few years of teaching that allowed me to teach half-time and serve in this role essentially as assistant housemaster, where I had responsibility for 200 children, high school youth, I should say, and I would combine the work as a teacher and an administrator. So I loved that because I loved the teaching, but being an English teacher and taking seriously what it means to grade papers, having a full load is a lot. And so this allowed me to teach and then to get very involved in school-wide issues. And it was then that I started to become really interested in the relationship of the teacher in the classroom and the school and the district. I think otherwise I wouldn't have had a sense of that whole organizational side of education, which ended up being very important to me.
So is that what inspired you to go back and earn your doctorate?
Yeah, I think in part I was eager to go back to school to learn. When you're teaching full time, it's just breathless, and I was really tired, and I just felt like I haven't really had a new thought in a long time, so why not go back to school? And I wasn't really clear about what I wanted to do, but I thought I would be an administrator, because that seemed to give you more control over things.
Sure.
You imagine it. My brother at the time actually was a doctoral student at Harvard, and he said they want to make sure that they have people becoming superintendents. So say that you want to be a superintendent. And that was actually as good an explanation as any I could find. I at least knew that that was a role. So when I started graduate school, doctoral program, I really expected that that's what I would do. And then my course changed.
How did it change?
Well, the program that I was in was called Administration, Planning, and Social Policy. And it included people who were planning to be in practice and people who were planning to do research. And we all had to take the same courses. So in many ways, I was as prepared to be a researcher,
sure.
Probably more prepared actually than to be an administrator. And I had a course with a professor named David Keekley, who was teaching a labor relations course, and I got fascinated by that and decided that I would write my qualifying paper about a topic in labor relations, and it was about the use of performance for teacher layoffs, which is actually a very current topic today.
Yes.
At the time, it was, something that was new. We were laying off teachers, and I was eager to see how they could be laid off by performance rather than seniority. And
yes.
So I did a study. And then just became very interested in the unions and collective bargaining as a policy that affected teachers. And by then it was pretty clear to me that I was very interested in the role of the teachers, the school as a workplace, and less in administrative practice, really. So then when I was deciding what to write my dissertation on, my advisor, Jerry Murphy, was working with David Cohen on a new policy center, and they had gotten a grant from the Ford Foundation, which, as I look back, was, I think, a 4-page letter where the money, it was a very simple, informal process. But they had proposed to have a study about unions in it, and neither of them really knew anything about unions at that time. So I looked at it and I said, I'll do that. And just consequently got involved in a fairly large study about the day-to-day practices of teachers in schools in the context of collective bargaining. So I did 300 interviews in 25 schools in 6 districts all around the country.
All for your dissertation work?
Yeah.
Wow.
So
your friend, colleague, and the former dean of the Harvard's Graduate School of Education, Pat Graham, recalls the time in your life, writing that you impressed her enormously with your discipline as you stolidly sat at your machine, an IBM Selectric typewriter,
right.
pecking away at your doctoral dissertation on teachers. After you graduated, tell us about your first academic position.
Well, I graduated, and at that point I had young children, and we were kind of, set here. My husband had a clinical practice, and he's a psychologist, and I wasn't really ready to move, and I didn't really see myself as an academic because I had just started to do research. I mean, it was relatively new for me. And so I had a position, I spent the first year under a grant from this policy center to turn my dissertation into a book. That was a part of my work. Okay. And then I also had a research job at the Principal Center at Harvard, as I was a research associate doing some work for them. So that was kind of a transition year. And people started to find things for me to do at Harvard, and I was sort of thinking, these are interesting. I'll spend the next year. Then what happened was they wanted to hire someone to study schools as organizations, and with a kind of policy focus on it. And I had very few publications at that point, but they asked me to apply, and it wasn't because the job was meant for me. It was because there were so few applicants for the position, because it wasn't something that people, it sort of was geared toward qualitative research. And so I applied, and initially my position was just half-time. They had 2 of us sharing the job, and then just gradually I stayed on. But it still was several years before I thought, okay, this may be a long-term gig for me, not not just a transition kind of time. And I loved the teaching. And I really enjoyed thinking about administrative practice and ended up doing some research about that. And it was it just kind of happened that way. I realized, okay, if I have to, if I have a long-term plan here, I have to think more about publications. I was very, very lucky. It was a wonderful place to.
And it ultimately turned into a tenure-track position, and then you went through the assistant professorship, and you had enough publications at that point. Right.
Although Harvard does not award tenure at the associate level, you have to be a full professor. Oh. So, at that time, it was necessary to publicize all open positions. So I essentially, for the tenure position, was competing with some other applicants, well-known,
sure,
well-published. So that was harrowing. But I don't know, it all worked out. And
So we talked to a lot of your former graduate students, and one of the common themes across all of them is what a wonderful teacher and what a wonderful mentor you have been ever since your arrival at Harvard. Related to this, your former graduate student, Will Marinell, noted that one of your most profound accomplishments, on top of all your books and articles, and has really been the scores of students that you have impacted throughout your career. Your daughter, Erica, also witnessed your impact on your students. She recalls the holiday parties that you threw for your students each year, feeding them desserts, hot cider, and eggnog. She remembers noticing a pattern to these events, though. Students would first come in, eat, and talk to each other, and within an hour she would find herself pulled into corners by earnest, teary-eyed students who would talk about how you had changed their lives. One after another, these students spoke of how you took care of them and pushed them to become more rigorous thinkers, more accomplished writers, and more thoughtful academics. They wondered if she knew how lucky she was to have you as a mom, and of course she always replied that she did. So a major theme here was also how you helped your students become writers. Why do you believe writing and the writing process is so important?
I think it's hard to separate thinking and writing. And I found that as students learn to write more clearly, they also understand their thoughts more clearly. And I think expression through writing is just very, very important. I mean, my students always laugh because I correct grammar, and I tell them the derivations of words, and because I love it in part. And my own children, I think I probably, was over their shoulders more than they would have liked on writing issues. But it really is about, I see it as a way of expressing really important thoughts, and that thinking about writing as communication. I know it seems really kind of obvious, but most people don't write with the reader in mind. And so helping people realize that there actually is not just one other person they're writing for, it's not just for a professor, it's for an audience. I often tell people, particularly when they're writing their dissertations, to not think about their committee, because then everybody second guesses what you already know, and why should I tell you that? But to create a kind of audience of people who would be interested in the topic and who don't know what you know. And so I just think writing's very exciting. I like to write.
Do you define yourself as a qualitative researcher? Or
I am. Done a little bit of quantitative work, but and I think it sometimes our students say, I'm going to do a qualitative research project because I don't find I'm very strong in statistics. I do qualitative research because the questions that interest me are about how and why, and so I'm very interested in strong quantitative findings. But I also find that the study I really want to do, and the one I think I have the most to contribute with, is about understanding how things work and explaining that.
It has that depth.